Hello and welcome to South Asia Focus. I am Smita Prakash. This week we have with us Samir Saran, who's a strategic policy expert and also heads a think tank in New Delhi, who will speak to us about the BRICS summit and whether India leading the newly formed BRICS Bank bodes well for the future. Before that, here's a brief introduction about the BRICS grouping. BRICS is the acronym for the association of 5 major emerging national economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. The BRICS grouping of nations consists of 3 billion people with a combined GDP of $16 trillion and an estimated $4 trillion in combined foreign exchange reserves. At a recently concluded BRICS summit in Brazil, leaders of the member nations agreed to launch a $100 billion development bank and a currency reserve pool in their first major step towards setting up of an alternative world order. The National Development Bank, NDB, aimed at funding infrastructure projects in developing nations, will be based in Shanghai, China. India will head the operations for the first 6 years, followed by 5-year terms for Brazil and then Russia. The summit was Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's first multilateral meeting since coming into power in May this year. Whether this BRICS Bank would undermine the US-EU global dominance or whether this alternative to the IMF World Bank will be a credible one is hard to predict at this stage. The future will also throw up a major challenge for the Indian Prime Minister Modi in trying to be a convincing voice in the group overwhelmingly dominated by China, who will contribute $41 billion to the new development bank compared with $18 billion each from Brazil, India and Russia and $5 billion from South Africa. Thank you for speaking with us, Samir. The creation of the BRICS Bank, now this was achieved after a lot of negotiations, tough negotiations. So tell me, is it possible to get equality in this grouping because of the representation that's been there? Even the representation, there was a lot of negotiation about how it should be equal despite there being disparity between China, India, Brazil, South Africa, all these countries. So tell me, is it possible to achieve equality?
So theoretically, Smita, first thank you for having me here, but theoretically it is possible. And I think that is what the intent of this current outcome statement is, to bring the smallest country, South Africa, on par with the biggest country in the grouping, which is China. And by giving them equal votes, subscribed capital, by equally subscribing to the capital, the intention is to allow this parity to take place. Now, over the longer term, as the business of the bank increases, you would have countries coming up with additional capital to support additional projects. And at that time, again, you will have to revisit this issue. Chances are that if you were to bring in outsiders, and I believe that the statement says that at least 55% of the subscribed capital will be with the BRICS, but that means 45% will be with outsiders. You will have to give them equity stake. Which means the BRICS will have to readjust their own proportionality within the ownership of the bank. Thereafter, you will find that when you require additional capital, you will have China coming forward and saying, okay, I have money to spare for this project. How will you deal that? How will you deal with that particular development? Would you have to give them additional shares, which would alter the balance, or would you give them shares without voting rights, whereby you can give them additional returns because of their investments, but not necessarily additional votes because of that investment? So theoretically it is possible. The intent has been shown. If we can hold this line, and the good news is that India has the presidency for the next 6 years, much of this would take place in this particular period. So we will be able to shape an agenda. We will be able to create a structure where a proportionate share of votes for the BRICS members remains at par.
But China will be hosting the bank. I mean, location is important. It's always location, location, location. You have the World Bank and you have IMF located in Washington, D.C. and you know the power emanates from the location. So there is
I have a different take on this, Smita. Again, I think Indians and Asians are prisoners to imagining an institution like this from their experiences around the World Bank and IMF. And because the World Bank and IMF are located in the US and the US has a quasi or a direct veto over their activities, we believe that location is equal to ownership. Now, I have a different take. I think location becomes immaterial if the ownership is equal. And we don't have that model to reference the BRIC experience.
I mean, even GEC Bank is going to be located either in Riyadh or in UAE.
Correct.
So
we don't have that experience before. So hence we have a skew when it comes to imagining the location to mean overbearance or preponderance of that particular country on its operations. I don't believe that is true. I believe that if you can make the governance equal, for example, you have a 50-50 joint venture of an American and Chinese company located in Shanghai. It doesn't mean China dominates that company. The same ethos has to be applied to an institution like this.
So will China not determine where the funding is to go for the projects?
Not at all. The reality is that we have agreed that each of us have equal say on the bank. The chair of the bank is Brazil, the president of the bank is India, China has equal votes with any one of us. So in that sense, all five of us can veto a particular direction, but all five of us have to agree to move in a particular direction.
But it also talks about funding. Now look at this, 41% of the funding by China, 18% from Brazil, India, Russia, 5% from South Africa. Now the imbalance is clearly visible.
But that is not the bank, that is the CRA. What you are talking about is the division of the CRA, the stabilization fund, which is actually a virtual fund. It does not exist. It is only a commitment by the sovereigns to deploy this amount of capital in case of a crisis, in case of a liquidity run.
That's just the point, isn't it? I mean, why would these countries come to this new bank? They're going to come here only because of a kind of a crisis.
Not true. The bank is not a crisis bank. The bank is a development bank. It is an infrastructure finance bank. It is a business as usual bank. You need to build roads, you need to build power plants, you need to build industrial parks, you need to promote small and medium enterprises, you give them capital. This is a lending bank like the World Bank. World Bank you don't go to for crisis. World Bank you go to develop. So this is a development bank. It's called the New Development Bank. The CRA on the other hand is a stabilization mechanism against liquidity and currency runs. And there the differential commitment levels are only sovereign commitments to come to the rescue up to this particular level. There is no question of ownership or power there, because those are crisis funds. It's like saying that during the European crisis, the BRICS committed a certain amount to stabilize Europe, in which again the China gave a much larger amount in comparison to Russia, India, Brazil and South Africa. I think the Indians committed 10 billion, the Chinese committed nearly 40 billion. But that does not give China any power over the bank. That's a different fund. I think those two must be segregated.
Right. When you talk about project funding, now the problem always occurs, especially with the World Bank. I mean, all our experiences are regarding the World Bank. It's the monitoring and the surveillance regarding those projects. How are we going to go over that stumbling block when it comes to BRICS?
So, again, I think we have to go back to the fundamental reason why the bank was created. I think this bank serves three purposes. The first purpose is to meet the additionality of requirement between what the existing financial institutions like the World Bank can cater to and what the aspirations and needs in the emerging and developing parts are. So one is to try and respond to this gap, and this is something that was spoken about even at the G20 meetings in 2010, 2011, and the World Bank itself has supported the idea of more such new banks to meet the new requirements. So that is the first purpose. The second purpose is what I call reform by doing. We've been demanding reforms in the way business is conducted in these financial institutions, and we have demanded primarily a governance reform. How is ownership distributed? How much weight and voice is offered to countries on the table, on the management table?
Which was skewed in the World Bank.
Which was skewed in the World Bank. So the BRICS have already, by announcing this bank and proportionate share for each BRICS countries, has already actually demonstrated an alternate model where the smallest country and the largest country will sit on equal power, will sit on parity at the management table. The third part of the purpose of this bank is to change the way conditionalities are imposed on recipients. We have to change the way we have dealt with countries who need this kind of finance. The World Bank and IMF have been very unfair in intervening or supporting the developing world. I mean, I remember that literally there was a gun to India's head in 1991.
Correct.
There was a bazooka staring down the Southeast Asian tigers in the late 90s.
During the Asian crisis.
During the Asian crisis. And during the European crisis, it was also sweet. You know, it was like, we have to somehow, the European countries, the fat, rich economies were somehow victims of their own promiscuous regulatory regimes. So this has to be changed. So I think the BRICS, the new development bank's next mission has to be to create business structure where we give far greater agency to the recipients of the finance and the funds that are flowing from this bank.
Is it the same model as the ADB and the others?
Not at all. I hope it is not. That was the whole idea. We don't want to create another ADB or World Bank. We must create a bank which has a southern ethos, where we give agency to the recipients as much as we give votes to the donors.
Okay. Now, has this bank arisen as a result of the stalemate on rebalancing of vote share in the IMF, World Bank?
I think the drivers are also the same, the three that I listed. One driver is that I don't think the existing development financial institutions have the capacity to cater to the needs that are now, very apparent in the emerging world. India needs $1 trillion every 5 years for the next 3 or 4 5-year cycles. So do other Asian and Latin American and African economies. World Bank cannot cater to those needs. So the first driver has to be the gap between what is available versus what is needed in the development finance sphere. The second is the ethos of governance and the lack of progress on reforms around the institutions such as the World Bank. Again, I think this is a great demonstration project. We are demonstrating a certain new democracy within these development finance institutions. Perhaps this could be a catalyst to the Bretton Woods institutions to have a look at themselves more deeply and acutely.
And actually, it's also risen because of the disappointment over Bretton Woods.
Absolutely. I think there is one of the promises when the G20 was actually created post-crisis was that we will reform, that we will change the institutions.
And nothing happened.
And nothing has happened till now. There have been very good grammar and vocabulary coming out on this, but there has been no political action or intent shown by either Europe or the US on.
And in these countries, they view this grouping, the BRICS grouping, with skepticism that it's just an anti-US platform. I mean, you've heard that before, that it doesn't have the US, it doesn't have Europe, it doesn't have West Asia. So basically, that's the biggest stumbling block, that there is nothing holding this grouping of nations other than being an anti-West platform. Do you agree?
So I think this is a myopic view of this grouping. This grouping is not anti-West. In fact, if I was to be, if I was to be a little provocative, I would say this is a grouping which is actually pro-establishment. This is a grouping where, for the first time, many of the BRICS members are assuming global leadership, assuming economic responsibility, are actually starting to do a lot of things that most Western countries have been insisting that we do. That is, take responsibility, underwrite checks for other people, worry about your neighbors, help your poor countries in your neighborhood. We are starting to do all of that. Where we are different is that we say that yes, we will take these responsibilities, but we will not play with your rules. We want the rules to be different. We want the rules to be far more considerate to people we engage with. And that is where the discomfort comes.
So it's not going to be a replacement of the World Bank, IMF. It's just going to be a supplementary financial institution?
It is an additionality. It is an additionality. It is complementary. It is supplementary. And hopefully it is a medium through which we will change the very ethos of development finance in the world.
Where will be the stumbling blocks?
Stumbling blocks are obviously apparent. Like in any very democratic system, sometimes there's a trade-off with efficiency. So unless you have a concurrence with all the 5 to do a particular project now, because all have equal votes, right? So there is an efficiency hurdle. Clearly, because you need a consensus on everything. So that's one challenge to the bank. The good news is that there is so much to do that no one is going to say no to infrastructure projects in most parts of the world. The controversial areas would be certain geographies where we might feel that certain country has a political problem or a political advantage. But those are going to be really small.
Small? Because look at the political establishments in all these countries. They are so divergent. Where will there be a consensus when it comes to development projects when politically you can't see eye to eye with any of those
For
nations?
example, why would, I would pose this as a question.
Why would
China is very keen.
Not build a road in Brazil?
Correct. China is very keen to invest billions in India. Why would China say no to projects in India in power sector, in road sector, in port sector, in other infrastructure areas. Why would they say no? They might have problems in Arunachal, but there is a whole India that exists outside of Arunachal. So again, like I'm saying, the areas of interest where the interests converge are far greater than the areas which might be hotspots.
Do you see Modi coming as Prime Minister of India and convergence of economic interests with China growing?
For the first time in Modi, China have someone who talks their language. He will be very tough on sovereign political issues with China, just as China is with America and Japan and other people. And he'll be very welcoming on economics, just as China is with America and Japan. So they will find a man who can do exactly what they have done with the world. Be tough politically, be very welcoming in the economic sphere, and find no contradiction in the two. We Indians have somehow tried to always create an algorithm where somehow politics, economics, culture, people to people, love, etc. all fits into the same formula. It doesn't happen.
Thank you very much for speaking with us, Samir.
Thanks, Smita.